Standing in my mother's elegant living room in my thrift store dress, I felt the familiar sting of not being good enough for my own family. My niece Madison looked me up and down with obvious disgust and announced loudly, "Honestly, Aunt Rachel, I don't understand why you even come to these things. You clearly don't belong here with successful people." The room went silent, and every pair of eyes turned to stare at me. That's when the doorbell rang, and my entire family was about to learn exactly who I really was and why Madison had just made the biggest mistake of her spoiled little life. I'm Rachel Turner, and I'm 38 years old. I work as a nurse practitioner here in Portland, Oregon, running a community clinic in the downtown area that serves low-income families. To look at me, you'd see someone who shops at secondhand stores, drives a 10-year-old Honda, and lives in a modest apartment in Southeast Portland. What my family doesn't know is that I've spent the last 15 years building something extraordinary, something that would shock every single person in that room if they knew the truth. The gathering that day was my mother Dorothy's 70th birthday celebration, held at her beautiful home in the exclusive West Hills neighborhood. My sister Patricia, who's 42 and one of Portland's most successful corporate lawyers, had organized the whole event. Patricia is married to Robert Cooper, who's 48, and owns one of the largest investment firms in the Pacific Northwest. Their daughter Madison, who's 24, has never worked a day in her life but considers herself an expert on success and social status. Also present were my uncle William Turner, who's 65 and recently retired as a federal judge, and my cousin Andrew Turner, who's 35 and founded a tech startup that sold for millions last year. This was a family of high achievers, successful people who measured worth by bank account balances and professional titles. And then there was me, the family embarrassment who chose to work with poor people instead of climbing the social ladder. Growing up, I'd always been the odd one out in the Turner family. While Patricia excelled in debate club and student government, I volunteered at animal shelters and tutoring programs. When she went to law school at Harvard, I chose nursing school at a state university. When she married Robert and moved into their mansion in the hills, I rented a studio apartment near the clinic where I worked. For years, my family had treated my career choice as a phase, something I'd eventually outgrow when I came to my senses and pursued real success. They'd make comments about how noble my work was, but always with that condescending tone that suggested they thought I was wasting my potential. Patricia would introduce me at social events as my sister who works with the less fortunate, like I was doing charity work instead of practicing medicine. The truth was more complicated than any of them realized. Yes, I worked at a community clinic, but I wasn't just an employee. 3 years after graduating nursing school, I'd started my own nonprofit organization focused on providing healthcare to homeless populations. What began as a small mobile clinic operating out of a converted van had grown into something much larger and more significant than anyone in my family imagined. Over the past 15 years, my organization had expanded to include 5 permanent clinics, 2 mobile units, and a residential treatment facility for people struggling with addiction and mental health issues. We'd helped over 10,000 people get back on their feet, and our model had been replicated in 12 other cities across the country. But I'd kept all of this quiet, partly because I didn't want recognition, and partly because I'd grown tired of my family's shallow definition of success. The financial reality of my situation was something I'd never discussed with anyone in my family. While they assumed I was barely scraping by on a nurse's salary, the truth was that my nonprofit had attracted major funding from foundations and government grants. I'd also written a book about community healthcare that had become required reading in medical schools nationwide, generating substantial royalties. My modest lifestyle was a choice, not a necessity. 6 months before my mother's birthday party, something had happened that would change my life forever. I'd been featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of their heroes of healthcare, recognizing my work in developing innovative programs for treating homeless populations. The article had led to speaking engagements, consulting contracts, and eventually, a job offer that seemed too good to be true. Johns Hopkins Hospital had offered me the position of Director of Community Health Initiatives, a role that would put me in charge of a $50 million program to revolutionize healthcare delivery in underserved communities. The salary they'd offered was more than my sister made as a partner in her law firm, but more importantly, it was a chance to expand my work on a national scale. I'd accepted the position but hadn't told my family yet. I was planning to announce it at my mother's birthday party, thinking it might finally earn me some respect from the people who'd spent decades treating me like a failure. I had no idea that my niece Madison would choose that moment to publicly humiliate me in front of everyone I cared about. The other secret I'd been keeping was even bigger. For the past 2 years, I'd been dating Dr. James Mitchell, who's 45 and one of the most respected cardiac surgeons on the West Coast. James was everything my family claimed to value: successful, wealthy, accomplished, but I'd kept our relationship private because I wanted to be sure he loved me for who I was, not for my family connections or social status. James had been out of town for a medical conference, but he'd promised to try to make it back in time for my mother's party. I hadn't expected him to actually show up, which is why I was planning to face my family's judgment alone. I had no idea that fate was about to intervene in the most dramatic way possible. The party had started off normally enough. Patricia had hired caterers and decorated the house with elaborate flower arrangements. The guest list included not just family members, but also some of my mother's wealthy friends and several of Robert's business associates. It was the kind of upscale social gathering where everyone competed to impress everyone else with their accomplishments and acquisitions. I'd arrived wearing a simple black dress I'd bought at a consignment shop, carrying a homemade birthday card and a small potted plant as a gift. Compared to the designer outfits and expensive jewelry worn by other guests, I looked like I'd wandered in from a different world. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone, especially Madison, who seemed to take personal offense at my appearance. Madison had always been particularly cruel to me, but her behavior that day was worse than usual. She made loud comments about my vintage dress, suggested that I might be more comfortable at a different kind of party, and generally treated me like an unwelcome intruder in my own family's celebration. Her friends, who'd also been invited, laughed at her jokes and joined in the mockery. The breaking point came when my mother was opening gifts. Patricia and Robert had given her an expensive piece of jewelry. Andrew had presented her with a first-class trip to Europe, and William had contributed a rare book for her collection. When it was my turn, I handed over my simple handmade card and the small plant, and I could see the disappointment in my mother's eyes. That's when Madison decided to deliver her devastating public humiliation, announcing to the entire room that I didn't belong there with successful people. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment as everyone stared at me. I was about to excuse myself and leave when the doorbell rang, and everything changed. The moment after Madison's cruel announcement felt like an eternity. I stood there in my mother's living room, surrounded by my family and their wealthy friends, feeling smaller and more insignificant than I had since high school. Patricia looked embarrassed but didn't defend me. Robert seemed uncomfortable but stayed silent. My mother just stared at the floor, clearly wishing this awkward moment would pass. Madison, however, wasn't finished with her public humiliation campaign. "I mean, look around this room," she continued, gesturing dramatically at the other guests. "We have lawyers, judges, business owners, entrepreneurs, people who've actually accomplished something with their lives. And then we have Aunt Rachel, who gives free medical care to drug addicts and homeless people." Her friends giggled at this description, and I could see some of the other guests nodding in agreement. In their world, success was measured by wealth and status, not by the impact you had on other people's lives. My choice to work with society's most vulnerable populations wasn't just incomprehensible to them, it was actively embarrassing. "Madison," my Uncle William said quietly, "that's enough." But Madison was on a roll now, empowered by the attention and apparently unaware that she was crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "No, Uncle William. Someone needs to say what everyone's thinking. It's awkward having Aunt Rachel at family events." She doesn't fit in, and she makes everyone uncomfortable. Andrew, my cousin, looked mortified. Madison, you're being incredibly rude. I'm being honest. Madison shot back. Look at her dress. Look at her car. Look at her apartment. She's a charity case herself. How can someone who can't even take care of herself properly be qualified to take care of other people? That comment hit me like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it revealed the depth of Madison's ignorance about my actual life and accomplishments. She'd constructed this entire narrative about my failure and inadequacy based on superficial observations, never bothering to learn the truth about what I'd achieved. Patricia finally spoke up, but her defense was half-hearted. Madison, your aunt works very hard. Not everyone needs to chase money and status. But some basic level of success would be nice, Madison replied. I mean, she's almost 40 and she's never even been married. No successful man would want to date someone who spends her time with society's rejects. The room was completely silent now, and I could feel tears starting to form in my eyes. This wasn't just about my career or my lifestyle choices. Madison was attacking my worth as a human being, suggesting that I was fundamentally unlovable and unsuccessful. That's when my mother, who'd been quiet throughout this entire exchange, finally found her voice. Madison Elizabeth Cooper, you will stop this immediately. Rachel is my daughter, and she's welcome in this house always. But the damage was already done. Madison had said out loud what I suspected my family had been thinking for years, that I was an embarrassment, a failure, someone who didn't belong in their successful, wealthy world. The worst part was that several people in the room were nodding along with her assessment. I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking, Madison said defensively. Aunt Rachel has made her choices, and those choices have consequences. She can't expect to be treated like she's accomplished something when she's obviously failed at life. Robert finally intervened. Madison, that's completely inappropriate. Apologize to your aunt right now. But Madison wasn't backing down. Why should I apologize for telling the truth? Look around this room, Dad. Everyone here has built something, achieved something, contributed something meaningful to society. What has Aunt Rachel done except enable people who refuse to help themselves? I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. These were people I'd loved my entire life, people whose approval I'd been seeking for decades, and they were sitting there listening to Madison destroy me without offering any meaningful defense. The few protests that had been made were weak and half-hearted, as if they agreed with her assessment but thought she was being too blunt about it. That's when the doorbell rang, cutting through the toxic atmosphere in the room. My mother looked confused. She wasn't expecting any more guests, and everyone who'd been invited was already there. I'll get it, Andrew said, clearly grateful for an excuse to escape the uncomfortable scene in the living room. As Andrew walked toward the front door, Madison continued her attack. Maybe whoever's at the door can give Aunt Rachel a ride home. She clearly doesn't have anywhere else she needs to be, and the rest of us would like to enjoy the party without feeling guilty about our success. The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This wasn't just thoughtless rudeness. It was calculated meanness designed to cause maximum pain. I was about to excuse myself and leave through the back door when I heard Andrew's voice from the front hallway. Dr. Mitchell, what a surprise! Please, come in! My heart stopped. James was here, which meant he'd made it back from his conference early. He was about to walk into a room where my niece had just finished publicly humiliating me in front of my entire family. I wasn't sure whether to be relieved or mortified. I hope I'm not intruding, I heard James say as his footsteps approached the living room. Rachel mentioned her mother's birthday party, and I wanted to stop by and wish Miss Turner a happy birthday. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was staring at the doorway, waiting to see who this unexpected guest was and why he was looking for me. I could see the confusion on their faces. Who was Dr. Mitchell, and why was he crashing their exclusive family gathering? Madison, however, wasn't finished with her performance. Oh, great, she said loudly. Now Aunt Rachel's charity case friends are showing up uninvited. This is exactly what I was talking about. That's when James walked into the room and everything changed forever. James Mitchell was not what anyone in that room had expected. At 45, he was tall, impeccably dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from being at the top of your profession. His shoes alone probably cost more than my entire outfit, and his watch was the kind that only extremely successful people wear. The room fell completely silent as James scanned the faces of my family members, clearly picking up on the tense atmosphere he'd walked into. His eyes found mine, and I could see him immediately assess that something was wrong. "Rachel," he said, warmly, crossing the room to give me a gentle hug. "I'm so sorry I'm late." The conference ran longer than expected, but I caught an earlier flight. The shock on everyone's faces was palpable. Madison's mouth had fallen open, and she was staring at James like she'd never seen a human being before. Patricia and Robert were exchanging glances that clearly communicated their confusion about who this man was and why he seemed to know me so well. My mother found her voice first. "Dr. Mitchell, is it? I'm Dorothy Turner, Rachel's mother. It's lovely to meet you, though I'm afraid we weren't expecting any additional guests." James smiled politely. "I completely understand, Mrs. Turner, and I apologize for the intrusion. I'm James Mitchell, and Rachel and I have been dating for the past 2 years. She's mentioned how important family is to her, and I didn't want to miss the chance to finally meet everyone." The silence that followed this introduction was so complete you could have heard a pin drop. My family was processing the information that I'd been in a serious relationship for 2 years without telling them, and that my boyfriend was clearly a very successful professional man. Madison, however, was the first to recover from the shock. "Dating?" she said incredulously. "Aunt Rachel, you never mentioned you were seeing anyone." "There's a lot about me you don't know," I replied quietly, still reeling from her earlier attack, but starting to feel a small surge of vindication. James, meanwhile, was taking in the room's dynamics with the kind of sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most sought-after surgeons in the country. I could see him connecting the dots, my obvious distress, the uncomfortable atmosphere, the way everyone was staring at us. "I hope I haven't interrupted anything important," James said diplomatically. That's when William, my uncle, the retired judge, stepped forward with his characteristic directness. "Dr. Mitchell, forgive me for asking, but what kind of doctor are you?" "I'm a cardiac surgeon," James replied. "I run the heart transplant program at Oregon Health and Science University, and I also have a private practice." The impact of this information was immediate and visible. Robert's eyebrows shot up. He clearly recognized that cardiac surgeons were among the highest-paid medical professionals. Patricia's entire demeanor shifted as she realized she was in the presence of someone who probably made more money than she did. But Madison, who'd spent the last 20 minutes attacking my life choices and social status, was having the hardest time processing this development. "Wait," she said slowly. "You're dating my Aunt Rachel? The nurse who works at the free clinic?" "Your Aunt Rachel," James said, and I could hear a slight edge in his voice, "is one of the most remarkable women I've ever met. I'm fortunate that she tolerates my busy schedule." Andrew, always the diplomat, stepped forward to shake James's hand. "Dr. Mitchell, it's an honor to meet you. I've actually heard of your work. Didn't you pioneer some new techniques in pediatric heart surgery?" James nodded modestly. "I've been fortunate to be part of some innovative research, yes. But honestly, the work that Rachel does is far more impressive than anything I've accomplished." This comment hit the room like a bombshell. Here was a world-renowned surgeon, someone at the absolute pinnacle of medical success, saying that my work was more impressive than his. The cognitive dissonance was visible on everyone's faces as they tried to reconcile this statement with their assumptions about my life. "I'm sorry," Madison said, clearly struggling to understand what was happening. "But what exactly do you do that's so impressive, Aunt Rachel? You work at a free clinic, right?" That's when James smiled, and I could see that he'd figured out exactly what had been happening before he arrived. Your aunt runs the Turner Foundation, one of the most successful healthcare nonprofits in the country. She's revolutionized how we deliver medical care to homeless populations, and her model is being implemented nationwide. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. This wasn't confusion or discomfort. This was shock. Pure, unadulterated shock as my family began to realize that everything they thought they knew about my life was completely wrong. The Turner Foundation? Patricia said slowly. I've heard of that organization. They were featured in the New England Journal of Medicine last year. That's right, James confirmed. Rachel's work has been groundbreaking. She's also written the definitive textbook on community health care, and she was just offered the position of Director of Community Health Initiatives at Johns Hopkins. I watched my family's faces as this information sank in. The Turner Foundation that Patricia had heard of, the one that had been featured in medical journals and praised by healthcare experts, was mine. The work they'd been dismissing as insignificant charity was actually revolutionary medical innovation. Madison looked like she was going to be sick. Johns Hopkins? She whispered. It's one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the world, James explained gently. They created this position specifically for Rachel. The salary alone is more than most people make in a lifetime. That's when my mother spoke up, and I could hear the dawning realization in her voice. Rachel, is this true? You've never mentioned any of this. I looked around the room at my family, the same people who'd just sat silently while Madison tore me apart for being unsuccessful and unaccomplished. There's a lot I've never mentioned, I said quietly. James moved closer to me, offering silent support. Rachel doesn't like to talk about her achievements, he said. She's incredibly modest about the fact that she's changing the world. What happened next was something never forget as long as I live. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, and I realized he was about to share something that would completely shatter my family's perception of who I was. Actually, James said, I have something here that I think you should all see. It just came out this week. He turned his phone screen toward the room, and I could see it was displaying the cover of Time magazine. There, in full color, was a photo of me in my scrubs, standing outside one of my mobile clinics. The headline read, Heroes of Healthcare. How one nurse is revolutionizing medicine for America's most vulnerable. The gasp that went through the room was audible. Madison actually stumbled backward, as if the image had physically struck her. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth, and Robert looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. This is the current issue of Time magazine, James explained calmly. Rachel is their featured cover story. The article talks about how her innovative approach to healthcare delivery has saved thousands of lives and influenced medical policy at the federal level. My mother reached for the phone with shaking hands. Rachel, you're on the cover of Time magazine? It came out on Monday, I said quietly. I was planning to tell everyone tonight, but I glanced at Madison, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Andrew was the first to really process what this meant. Rachel, this is incredible. Time magazine doesn't feature people unless they've done something truly extraordinary. The article mentions that Rachel has been invited to speak at the World Health Organization next month. James continued. She's also being considered for a MacArthur Fellowship. Madison finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. A MacArthur Fellowship? That's the Genius Grant. It's one of the most prestigious awards in the world, William confirmed, his voice filled with awe. Rachel, why didn't you tell us about any of this? I looked around the room at my family, the same people who, just minutes earlier, had listened while Madison publicly humiliated me for my lack of success. Would it have mattered? I asked. For 15 years, you've all treated my work like it was worthless because it didn't come with a big salary or social status. Why would external validation change that? The truth in that statement hit everyone like a slap. Patricia looked mortified. Robert seemed unable to meet my eyes, and my mother was clearly struggling with the realization of how badly she'd misjudged her own daughter. But James wasn't finished. "There's something else you should know," he said, and I could tell he was about to drop an even bigger bombshell. "Rachel and I are engaged." This announcement caused such a commotion that several people started talking at once. My mother grabbed my hand to look for a ring. Andrew started congratulating us, and Patricia looked like she might faint. But it was Madison's reaction that everyone noticed. She had turned completely white and was staring at James like he was speaking a foreign language. "Engaged?" she repeated weakly. "I proposed last month," James said, smiling at me, "though Rachel hasn't said yes yet. She wanted to think about whether she was ready to balance marriage with her new position at Johns Hopkins." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. 20 minutes earlier, Madison had announced that I was unloved and unmarried because no successful man would want me. Now she was learning that one of the most successful men in Portland had not only wanted me, but had asked me to marry him. "I can't believe this," Madison whispered, and for the first time all evening her voice held no cruelty, just shock and dawning horror at what she'd done. "Believe what?" James asked, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what had been happening before he arrived. Madison started, then stopped, clearly, realizing that there was no way to explain her behavior that wouldn't make her look terrible. That's when my mother stepped forward and did something that surprised everyone. She walked directly to Madison and said, in a voice that carried absolute authority, "You owe your aunt an apology, immediately." "Mom," Patricia started, but my mother cut her off with a look. "No," my mother said firmly. "What happened here tonight was unacceptable. Rachel has been accomplished and successful for years, but even if she hadn't been, the way Madison treated her was cruel and wrong." Madison looked around the room, clearly hoping someone would rescue her, but everyone was staring at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. The friends who'd been laughing at her jokes earlier were now looking embarrassed to be associated with her behavior. "Aunt Rachel," Madison said quietly, "I'm sorry. I had no idea." "No," I interrupted. "You had no idea because you never asked. You made assumptions based on appearances and never bothered to learn who I actually was or what I'd actually achieved." James moved closer to me, offering support. "Madison," he said gently but firmly, "your aunt is going to be featured in medical textbooks for generations. Children who are alive today because of her innovations will grow up not knowing her name, but knowing the benefit of her work. That's true success." The weight of what Madison had done was finally sinking in. She'd publicly humiliated a Time magazine cover story, a woman who was revolutionizing healthcare and engaged to one of the most respected surgeons in the country. But more than that, she'd revealed the ugliness in her own character and values. "I don't understand," Madison said desperately. "If you're so successful, why do you dress like? Why do you live like?" "Like what?" I asked. "Like someone who cares more about helping people than impressing them." Robert finally spoke up. "Rachel, we owe you an apology, all of us. We've been judging you based on superficial things instead of recognizing your accomplishments." "The real problem," I said, looking around the room, "is that you only care about my accomplishments now that you know they exist. For 15 years you dismissed my work because it involved helping poor people instead of making money. That says more about your values than it does about mine." James squeezed my hand supportively. "Your family loves you, Rachel. Sometimes love gets confused with other things, but that doesn't mean it isn't real." The rest of the evening was unlike anything I could have imagined when I'd arrived at my mother's house that afternoon. Word of James's arrival and the revelations about my career spread quickly among the guests, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk to me about my work, my Time magazine feature, and my engagement to one of Portland's most prominent doctors. Madison spent the remainder of the party in what could only be described as stunned silence. Her friends, who'd been enjoying her cruel commentary earlier, were now giving her a wide berth, clearly embarrassed by their association with her behavior. Several guests made a point of approaching me to apologize for not defending me earlier and to express their admiration for my accomplishments. Patricia pulled me aside about an hour later, tears in her eyes. "Rachel, I am so sorry. I've been a terrible sister and an even worse person. I had no idea what you'd achieved, but that's not an excuse for how I've treated you all these years." "Patricia," I said gently, "the work was always important, whether anyone knew about it or not. The problem wasn't that you didn't know about the Time magazine article, it's that you never valued what I was doing in the first place." She nodded, clearly struggling with this realization. "You're right. I've been so focused on conventional success that I completely missed the fact that my little sister was changing the world. My conversation with my mother was even more emotional. She sat me down in her bedroom, away from the party, and apologized through tears for not seeing what was right in front of her. "I raised you to be compassionate and giving," she said, "and then I somehow forgot that those were the most important qualities a person could have." James, meanwhile, was handling the social dynamics of the party with the grace and charm that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. He answered questions about his work, complimented my mother on her beautiful home, and made conversation with my relatives like he'd been part of the family for years. The most difficult conversation was with Madison herself. As the party was winding down, she approached me with red eyes and a face full of shame. "Aunt Rachel," she said quietly, "I don't know how to apologize for what I did tonight." "You don't need to know how," I replied. "You just need to mean it." "I do mean it. I was horrible to you and I said things that were unforgivable. I don't understand how I became the kind of person who would treat family that way." I looked at my niece, this young woman who'd caused me so much pain just a few hours earlier, and realized that her cruelty had come from a place of insecurity and misguided values rather than inherent malice. "Madison, you're 24 years old. You have time to become a better person if you choose to. How can you even stand to look at me after what I said?" "Because holding grudges hurts me more than it hurts you," I said. "But Madison, you need to think seriously about what happened here tonight. You attacked someone you love based on assumptions and superficial judgments. That's not who you want to be." James joined us as this conversation was ending, and I could see that Madison was intimidated by his presence, not because he was unfriendly, but because he represented everything she'd claimed I could never have. "Dr. Mitchell," Madison said hesitantly, "I'm sorry you had to witness my behavior tonight." "Madison," James replied kindly, "everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do next." 6 months later, I accepted the position at Johns Hopkins and moved to Baltimore to begin what would become the most challenging and rewarding phase of my career. The $50 million program I was hired to direct exceeded every expectation, and within 2 years, we'd expanded it to include partnerships with medical schools across the country. James and I were married in a small ceremony at Powell Butte, surrounded by the friends and colleagues who'd supported my work for years. My family all attended, and their behavior was a complete contrast to the way they'd treated me at my mother's birthday party. They'd learned to value my accomplishments not because of external recognition, but because they'd finally understood the importance of the work itself. Madison underwent what could only be described as a complete transformation. She enrolled in nursing school and began volunteering at homeless shelters, determined to understand the population she'd dismissed so casually. She eventually joined the Turner Foundation as a program coordinator and proved to be one of our most dedicated and effective team members. The Time magazine article led to speaking engagements around the world, a best-selling book about healthcare innovation, and eventually, the MacArthur Fellowship that James had mentioned. But more importantly, it opened doors for expanding our work to serve even more vulnerable populations. My relationship with my family recovered and even improved beyond what it had been before. Patricia and I became closer than we'd ever been. bonded by honest conversations about success, values, and what really matters in life. My mother became one of the Turner Foundation's biggest supporters, hosting fundraising events and using her social connections to raise money for our programs. The most satisfying development was watching how the rest of my family began to reassess their own definitions of success. Andrew started donating his tech expertise to nonprofit organizations, William began volunteering with legal aid societies, and even Robert redirected some of his investment firm's focus towards social impact investing. 5 years after that horrible birthday party, I was invited to speak at a medical conference in Portland. During my presentation about community healthcare innovation, I looked out into the audience and saw Madison sitting in the front row, wearing scrubs and taking detailed notes. She graduated nursing school with honors and was working as a case manager for homeless veterans. After my presentation, Madison approached me with tears in her eyes. "Aunt Rachel," she said, "I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me after what I did that night." "You gave up on yourself, Madison." "I never did. I've learned so much about the people I used to dismiss," she said. "Every patient I work with now reminds me of how wrong I was about everything." Looking back, I realized that my niece's cruel behavior that night was actually a gift, though it certainly didn't feel like one at the time. It forced my family to confront their shallow values and prejudices, and it led to honest conversations that ultimately brought us closer together. The woman who walked into my mother's house that day feeling ashamed and inadequate was the same woman who walked out engaged to a brilliant surgeon and recognized as a healthcare innovator. The only thing that had changed was other people's perception of my worth, but that change had been enough to transform my relationship with my family forever. Sometimes the most painful moments in our lives become the catalyst for the most important growth. Madison's attack that night was devastating, but it also revealed truths that needed to be spoken and forced changes that needed to happen. And when I think about the young woman who used to shop at thrift stores because she was secretly saving every penny for her nonprofit work, I'm proud of the choices I made and the values I maintained, even when no one else understood or appreciated them. The person who walked through that door wasn't just Dr. James Mitchell, it was validation itself. Proof that success comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows until someone finally turns on the lights.